Be invited to give this talk. I think there'll be some resonances between what I have to say and what a number of other people have said over the course of the last 2 really wonderful days. And before I start taking myself too seriously, I should say that when I mentioned to my partner that my talk was at about 3 p.m., she said, "Oh, it's that unusual talk they put at the end of the BNPA every year." So, I suspect that everyone in this room, at one time or another, has asked herself or himself, what is it that's special about the human mind? And one strong candidate, I think, is imagination. Our capacity to recollect the past, anticipate the future, enter the virtual world created by a novelist, or the highly imaginative world created by a scientist. So I agree with Robin Dunbar, the anthropologist, that what sets us apart is a life in the mind, the ability to imagine. And with that thought in the background, I was very intrigued when, almost 20 years ago now, Charles Wallow, the professor of the department I then worked in Edinburgh, handed me this letter saying, "Adam, I think this is your kind of thing. You're due to see this gentleman in March. He's had a coronary procedure, an angioplasty. Following this procedure, he's become aware of the fact that he's now unable to imagine anything. He notes this particularly at night when he's never been a good sleeper and previously used to imagine things to help himself get off to sleep, but now can't do so. Can't picture his children or his grandchildren in his mind, whereas previously he could. I'd not heard of anything similar. Please see and advise." I hadn't heard of anything similar either. I'm going to come back to the case of MX in a moment, and to a rather serendipitous line of research which has flowed from encountering that particular patient. But I thought just to make sure that we're on the same page, I should begin by telling you a little about visualization, and starting with the visualization exercise. So this is going to be a little rough and ready, but I'd like you to engage in visualization now. I'd like you to visualize a rising sun. Consider carefully the picture that becomes before your mind's eye as the sun rises above the horizon into a hazy sky. The sky clears and surrounds the sun with blueness. Clouds appear. A storm blows up. There are flashes of lightning. And a rainbow appears. Now, most of you will have had something that approaches a visual experience as I read those words, and I'd like you to try, again, in a very rough and ready way, to rate the vividness of your image. Were the images that were appearing before you perfectly clear, as vivid as real seeing, clear and reasonably vivid, moderately clear and lively, vague and dim, or was there no image at all? You only knew that you were thinking of the object. And there will be a considerable variation in your scores within this room. These are questions from the Vividness of Visual Imagery questionnaire. And if you'd scored yourself on each scenario, your maximum score would be 20, your lowest score would be 4. And my guess would be that the majority of scores in this room will fall in the low teens, but some of you will be up towards the ceiling, and a few of you down towards the floor. Most of us, when we recollect last year's holiday, if we pick out a particular episode, we'll have a memory which has some visual content. Most of us, when we read novels, begin to inhabit a visual world. We often visualize when we daydream. Almost all of us visualize when we dream at night, and visualization has been described as playing an important part in creativity, both in the sciences and the arts. It seems to play an important role in driving emotion and cravings, and it's used in therapy, for example, in EMDR. Trainers use visualization in mental practice. Adrian Owen made use of it in his famous work exploring consciousness in the vegetative state. And if you catch people on the wing using descriptive experience sampling, so a buzzer sounds in your pocket and you have to report your experience at that particular moment, it turns out that actually the commonest mental content is a visual image, inner seeing, also known as images, occurring in about 34% of cases. Cognitive neuroscientists interested in visualization think of it as a weak form of perception. And there's one very nice, extremely simple experiment which illustrates this point. If you visualize a dark room, a face in shade, and then a face in sunlight, it turns out that your pupil will constrict as the image becomes brighter. If you visualize a sunny sky, night sky, cloudy sky, your pupil will dilate. So this illustrates the very close analogy, or close, really mechanistic resemblance between perception and imagination. Of course, imagery is a subjective phenomenon. but there have been efforts with some success to objectify the strength of imagery. And Joel Pearson, who's a cognitive neuroscientist in Sydney, has developed a technique which makes use of binocular rivalry to measure the strength of visual imagery. So if you are presented simultaneously with a green grid, a vertical grid, and a red horizontal grid, your percept tends to alternate between one and the other. But if before the binocular stimuli are presented, you imagine one or the other, that will bias your percept, and you can use the degree of that bias as a measure of imagery strength, which turns out to be quite informative. So with that brief background in imagery science, and I'll be telling you more about the neural basis of visualization in the course of the talk, let's come back to MX and hear, I hope, from him. We're not hearing from him.
Angioplasty.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed at night when I went to bed that I couldn't do what I usually did, which was, before going to sleep, thinking about my family, my children, my grandchildren, and picturing them. They just wouldn't come to mind. And also, I used to have a technique to go to sleep if I couldn't get to sleep, and that was to start at 99 and count backwards. But looking at the numbers, either black and white or white and black, and watch them in my mind's eye and click them off, and I never got down to 1. I was asleep by then. So that was about 3 weeks after I'd had the angioplasty.
Mm-hmm. Did you find that all visual imagery had disappeared? So were you able to visualize places which you'd visited, for example?
No, I couldn't visualize anything. I could remember them, but I couldn't visualize them.
Mm-hmm. And you don't think that the inability to visualize has had very much impact on your ability to remember?
As far as I can see, it hasn't had any effect at all.
Mm-hmm.
My memory's as good as it was,
mm-hmm.
I think.
Even to remember visual details?
Yes, I know that sounds a bit odd. Even to remember visual details, which I can't see,
mm-hmm.
but I can remember.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You just know?
I just know, but I can't see them, and I can't explain that.
So he presented with a very selective deficit of visualization, and I hadn't encountered anything like this before, so I went to have a look to see whether anyone else had. And of course, there was a series of cases in the literature, as there always is, starting with Charcot's case from the 1880s, which, as we'll see, was a fertile decade for imagery research. And Charcot had a patient who kept a very eloquent diary, who abruptly lost imagery. The visual memory of forms and color completely disappeared, and at the same time he found that he had difficulty in recognizing faces, he had some difficulty in recognizing familiar places, he felt that his visual memory was somewhat impaired, and his dreams became avisual, as was the case for MX. And he wrote in his diary, "If you were to ask me to represent the towers of Notre Dame, a browsing sheep, or a ship in distress on the open sea, I should have to reply to you that although I know perfectly well how to distinguish these different objects and perfectly well know all about them, they have for me no meaning at all as regards mental vision." Martha Farrer, the American psychologist in the 1980s, pulled together the cases of imagery loss that had been described to that point in the literature, around 50 of them, and she tried to classify them using a fairly simple, intuitive model of visual imagery developed by Stephen Coslin. So the idea here is that information streams in through the eyes and gets encoded in the visual buffer, which is more or less the visual cortices. And then you can do a number of things with the information in the visual buffer, but commonly we will match what we're seeing to our knowledge of the appearances of things in long-term visual memory, and that allows us to recognize them. If something happens to your visual engrams, then you will both become unable to recognize things and become unable to visualize them. And she felt that this kind of pathology accounted for one group of cases. Then there were others in whom there seemed to be some relatively low-level visual defect, which was interfering both with visualization and with recognition. And then there was a third group of people who had visual imagery generation deficits, who were perfectly well able to recognize, but could no longer see things in their mind's eye. So MX would fall into that group. Over the following years, people began to explore visualization using functional imaging and showed that, as one might imagine intuitively, and as cognitive neuroscientists have suggested, visual imagery is indeed a kind of weak echo of perception. So here is brain activation when you look at a face, with strong activity in the fusiform gyrus, superior temporal sulcus, amygdala. When you visualize a face, you see activity in the same group of areas, but it's a bit weaker. But of course, when you visualize, as opposed to when you look, you're making a deliberate decision to summon up an image. And you would expect, therefore, that there would be some activity in frontoparietal regions involved in executive control and attention, and that turns out to be the case. So returning to MX, he gave a very articulate description of the change in his experience. As you've heard, he could no longer see anything in his mind's eye. He said that when he read a novel, he no longer entered a visual world. His dreams became avisual. He felt there'd been a subtle effect on his visual memories. So he said, for example, when I lost my keys in the past, I'd be able to visualize where I put them down. That's no longer the case. My monitor has failed. When I try to visualize, I experience a complete blank. My visual quotient should be 0. Interestingly, he remained interested in the visual world. In fact, he went on a watercolor painting class, course at Locté, but he said subjectively it was as if his perception and visual memory remained intact, but he had completely lost the ability to summon things to the mind's eye. He was otherwise well in body and mind, apart from his coronary artery disease. There was no striking abnormality on his MRI scan. Standard neuropsychology was normal. His subjective imagery was impaired markedly, as you would expect, but rather oddly, he performed well on tests that are meant to be sensitive to visual imagery. So if I ask you, for example, which is darker, the green of grass or the green of a pine tree, most of you will probably find yourself comparing shades of green in your mind's eye and then answering the question. He could answer questions like that completely accurately. And when you asked him how, he said, well, I just know. I can't see anything, but I just know. And that seemed plausible. It seemed that the tests that purport to measure visual imagery don't necessarily do so. They certainly tap into semantic knowledge as well as the ability to visualize. So we described his case as one of blind imagination by analogy with blind sight. So people with blind sight lack visual experience, but nevertheless they can guide action under visual control in some circumstances. Similarly, MX lacked the ability to visualize, but nevertheless he could ask questions which you might have thought would presuppose the ability to visualize. So because of this failure to find an objective correlate, if you like, in the neuropsychology for his imagery loss, we went on to perform a functional imaging study. And in this, we showed him famous faces and asked him to visualize them. And when we showed him the famous faces, his brain activation was entirely normal. So when you subtracted his brain activity from controls, there was no difference. However, when he tried to visualize famous faces, he failed to activate occipitotemporal regions, including the fusiform face area, which you or I would activate when we visualize, and he hyperactivated frontal areas, including the anterior cingulate. So here is a neural correlate for his aphantasia, or for his loss of imagery, I should say. I didn't expect too much more to come of this. He wrote a paper. It got picked up by Carl Zeman, who's an American science journalist who wrote an article in Discover, which I think is the American equivalent of New Scientist. And over the course of the next few years, I was contacted by about 20 people who said, I'm just like this guy, but I always have been. I've always realized there's something a little bit different about me. When other people talk about visualizing, I don't seem to be able to do it. My mind's eye is black. And as you might expect, they scored towards floor on the vividness of visual imagery questionnaire, as opposed to the bell curve which you see here in a population of several hundred undergraduates. Now, we felt that this phenomenon deserved a term, a flag to fly under, a term to describe it, because the words used in the literature were rather unwieldy. So defective revisualization or visual irreminiscence were terms that had been used in papers describing people who had lost their mind's eye as a result of some form of neurological injury. So I consulted a friend, a classicist friend, and asked him what term he would suggest. And he said, well, why don't you borrow from Aristotle? Aristotle's term for the mind's eye was phantasia, and tag an A on at the end. So that was the birth of aphantasia. And in 2015, we described this small group of 21 individuals who told a reasonably consistent story. So they all said that they had lacked a mind's eye for as long as they could remember. but they tended to notice it in their teens or 20s. It would often come to light in conversation with friends or family. Everyone would be reminiscing, describing last year's holiday, a wedding they'd been to, a party, and they would get the impression that other people were having an experience that was a little bit visual to which they did not have access. Very commonly, they said that up till then they had assumed that talk of the mind's eye was entirely metaphorical, and now they realized that there was a little more to it than that. Didn't by and large have a huge emotional impact. Most of our participants were curious rather than dismayed. There was some variability within the group, so about half of them said, I don't really know what it would be like to have sensory imagery at all. I don't have a mind's ear. I can't imagine feeling something with my fingers. The other half said that it was only vision that was affected, so an interesting hint of variation there. And then the majority said, I thought very interestingly, that they dreamt visually, even though they couldn't summon imagery to mind during the day. So suggestion of a dissociation between wakeful and dreaming imagery. The majority said they had rather poor autobiographical memory. Many of them claimed verbal, analytical, mathematical strengths, but then of course they were all readers of Discover magazine, so a somewhat biased sample. And then we asked them to answer a question which proved quite telling. We said, can you, in your mind, walk around your flat or your apartment and count the number of windows? And they could all do this accurately, but they gave interesting descriptions of what they were doing. So they would say such things as 5 windows, I remember them, but I don't see them. My thought is intentional and object-orientated, and I consider the windows to be in mind. Or I sort of fly through the house and inspect every room if the idea of a window is present, and where. It's definitely not an image. It's more like understanding the idea of a window being there. I know it's there. So had we discovered something entirely new, lifelong absence of the mind's eye? Of course not. When I got round to reading the older literature, I discovered that Galton had recognized this. He was mentioned earlier today, I think in the 1880s. He was the first person to quantify the vividness of visual imagery. He developed a nice breakfast table questionnaire. It's a very Victorian instrument. It asks you to visualize your breakfast table as you left it this morning and rate the vividness of your image of the various items which you used while you were breakfasting. And he noticed that there were a few participants whose powers of visualization were 0. He thought that this was commoner in scientists than in women and children in particular. So he drew attention to this phenomenon, but there was a strange failure to follow up on his observation. But others in the 1880s paid attention to visual imagery and the loss of imagery. So Cotard, who many of you will know from Cotard's delusion, the delusional belief that you have died or you no longer exist, thought that loss of the mind's eye was an integral part of the state of mind that led to the formation of that delusion. And Charcot, who I've already mentioned to you, of course, described a case of acquired aphantasia in the 1880s. So there was a flurry of interest then, followed by a marked lack of interest over the next 100 years or so. With one honorable exception, an American psychologist, Bill Four, who himself lacks a mind's eye, conducted a survey among his undergraduates and estimated that about 2 or 3% appeared to be without imagery. And then there were a couple of other lines of research that were relevant. So people studying congenital prosopagnosia, lifelong difficulty in recognizing faces, had noticed that people with this condition seem to have rather weak imagery, whereas conversely, people with synesthesia, the merging of the senses, on the whole tend to have rather vivid imagery. So I'm going to take you on a little detour now and tell you about the work of an interdisciplinary project which I've been involved in, the EyesMind project, which was funded in 2015 or so by the AHRC to research a number of aspects of visual imagery relevant to this theme. Now, you will know, many of you, that if you want to get a grant these days, you have to pretty much promise the earth. So we said, well, we're going to read everything that's ever been written about visual imagery and the history of human thought, and we're going to distill that into a paper. We're going to perform a meta-analysis of all functional imaging studies of visualization and write about that. And we're going to create a register of people with aphantasia and hyperphantasia. And we more or less did. So, as you can see, we're a very glamorous interdisciplinary group consisting of an art historian, John Anions, a philosopher, Fiona McPherson, an artist, a neurophysiologist, a postdoc, and me. And I'll tell you a little about these 3 lines of work, which will bring us back to aphantasia and its converse, hyperphantasia. So what about the history of thinking about imagery? We thought this was worth looking at, just on the grounds that the history of a subject is the subject. If you're scholarly, you want to know something about what people have thought about your topic of interest in the past. And we thought it was particularly worthwhile conducting this exercise because so much had been discovered about the psychology and neuroscience of visualization over the last 30 years or so. It was fun to look back, to frame the old in the light of the new, and to ask whether there might be any insights or challenges for neuroscience in the older literature. And it proved, I think, to be a more interesting exercise than perhaps we had feared, partly because the people we read fell fairly clearly into two football teams. So Plato is an imagery denigrator, if not an imagery denier. He writes, "The philosopher uses no object of sense, but only pure ideas moving on through ideas to ideas and ending with ideas." Of course, he thought that the real world was a shadow, so an image is a shadow of a shadow. And he felt this was something that images were for things that philosophers should on the whole shun. Whereas Aristotle, conversely, is an imagery enthusiast. He wrote, "The soul, in fact, never thinks without a phantasma." And Aquinas, the medieval philosopher, followed him. "Everyone can experience within oneself," claims Aquinas, "that when one tries to understand something, one forms certain phantasms for oneself by way of examples, in which one examines, as it were, the thing one is striving to understand. And so it is that when we wish to make someone else understand a thing, we propose examples to him through which he can form phantasms for himself in order to understand. So my effort to convey my ideas to you is a kind of implanting of my phantasms into your head." And David Hume in the 18th century was even more enthusiastic about imagery. "When I shut my eyes and think of my study, the ideas I form are exact representations of the impressions I felt when I was in my study. Every detail in one is to be found in the other." But on the other hand, there were people like Watson who seemed perhaps not to quite know what imagery was. So here is Watson. I find this a rather chilling passage. He writes, "When a person closes his eyes and says, 'I see the house where I was born, the trundle bed in my mother's room where I used to sleep, I can even see my mother as she comes to tuck me in,' that person is merely dramatizing. The behaviorist finds no proof of imagery in all this. We have put all these things in words long, long ago." And then Wittgenstein, in similar vein, "Suppose that someone were to draw while he had an image, or instead of having it, they were only with his finger in the air. He could be asked, 'Whom does that represent?' And his answer would be decisive. It is quite as if he had given a verbal description, and such a description can also simply take the place of the image." Zenon Pilishin, who was one of the protagonists in the imagery debate, which took place towards the end of the last century, which I'll tell you a little bit more about, wrote, "Mental imagery should be understood to consist in abstract mental structures to which we do not have conscious access and which are essentially conceptual and propositional rather than pictorial in nature," whereas Stephen Coslin, who was on the other side of the debate, wrote, "Imagery relies on representations that depict information, not describe it." So as we read these historical authors, we had the impression that their views seemed to some extent depend on the vividness of their own mental imagery. And Stephen Coslin, in fact, explored that possibility in the course of the imagery debate. So there was a Pilishin camp who argued that imagery was essentially propositional, a Coslin camp who argued that it was depictive, and it turned out that your view in this debate correlated with the vividness of your imagery. So we described this work in a paper written by Matthew, our postdoc. So that was the first line of work. Then the second line of work was an attempt to make sense of the quite large number of papers now which have been written about brain activation during visualization. And this seemed a good idea when we started, and I think it was a good idea, but it turns out to be quite difficult because, of course, the fairly numerous studies involve very different approaches. So some tasks involve visualizing objects, others involve visualizing spatial arrays, some involve some element of transformation, others not. Control conditions vary. Sometimes there's a perceptual control condition, or a rest control condition, or a control condition involving an active task. Eyes may be open or closed. Stimuli may be presented auditorily or visually. You may be asked to retrieve imagery from long-term or short-term memory. Sometimes the control task involves language. The item to be imagined may be more or less general, specific, or familiar. So wide variability in the details of the task. But nevertheless, we thought it was worth pulling them together and seeing what wisdom we could distill. 40 studies, 464 participants, 634 foci. Crawford Winlove, my neuroscientist colleague, conducted an activation likelihood estimate meta-analysis, and he used the Glaser Atlas, which we've heard about earlier today, which has boosted the 50 or so Brodmann areas to about 160 cortical areas using a variety of sources of evidence to parcellate them. And we established that there is indeed, as you might predict, an imagery network, so I won't take you through every area on this table, but I'll introduce you to a few of them. So the strongest single area of activation is in the left superior parietal cortex. There is some activation also on the right, but rather less strong in much the same area. There's been a big debate in the imagery literature about whether primary visual cortex is or is not activated, and in our meta-analysis, it is. There's also, in many studies, been what is often described as anterior cingulate activation, though Crawford tells me this is actually in the cingulate and supplementary eye movement area, which is of interest because eye movements are known to play a part in visualization. People often move their eyes as they visualize. There isn't much activation in areas intervening between area 17 and higher order visual cortex, but there is some activity in and around the fusiform face area on the inferior surface of the temporal lobe, and there is some superior and inferior prefrontal activation. So as you might predict, a network of regions involved in this quite complex psychological task, and here it is in an animation. So this brings us back to the theme of aphantasia and hyperphantasia. And there was a second surprise after our 2015 paper, which was that the press got quite interested in this, picked up the story, and this has been really very good for the project, which has become a kind of exercise in citizen science, with about 14,000 people getting in touch as a result of the publicity. So we've been able to look in a much larger number of folk at the features of visual imagery vividness extremes, aphantasia on the one hand, hyperphantasia on the other, very vivid imagery. We tried to respond to all 14,000 males by asking people, inviting people to take part in a project in which they would complete the VVIQ and answer a range of common sense questions about matters that seemed relevant on the basis of our previous work. So for example, do they dream visually? How good or bad is their autobiographical memory? And I'll give you a kind of impressionistic run through the results and then tell you about an attempt to objectify some of those which we're in the process of writing up. So the first kind of gratifying surprise was that many people were really very grateful. The greatest mystery of my life explained. It was the first time I'd heard the word, but I cried when I read it. I'd always thought there was something a bit wrong with me. I feel like my mind has been blown. I've always wondered what was wrong with my brain because I can't visualize or meditate the way other people can. It turns out that there's really quite a large number of people who recognize this quirk in their psychological nature, but find it quite hard to explain to others. The link with face recognition difficulties has held up, so I'm sure that you can all identify the true famous person in each of these arrays of 4 images, but it turns out that about a third, or rather over a third, of those with aphantasia reckon that they have unusually poor face recognition ability, whereas those with hyperphantasia reckon that they do rather better than controls. This is, of course, a subjective report, but I think it's worthy of at least further exploration. Then again, a substantial proportion of people with aphantasia report that they have rather thin autobiographical memory, and at about this time that we described aphantasia, Brian Levine in Toronto described the severely deficient autobiographical memory syndrome. So this is an interesting condition, described initially in just 4 participants, all of whom had led normal, productive, active professional lives, but who nevertheless had a very striking selective autobiographical memory impairment with, as it turned out on neuropsychological assessment, some impairment of visual memory, and on exploration of biomarkers, a reduced engagement of the autobiographical memory network using fMRI, reduced ERP indices for laboratory memory materials, and reduced gamma synchrony and theta phase coupling during autobiographical recollection. Now, it wouldn't be too surprising if lacking visual imagery had an impact on autobiographical memory, because visual areas are among those which are activated during autobiographical recollection. This is a meta-analysis of functional imaging studies of autobiographical recollection, and you can see that a substantial proportion, 35% or so, of aphantasic participants report having markedly poor autobiographical memory, whereas an excess of hyperphantasic participants report having exceptionally good autobiographical memory. So at least at the level of subjective report, those two associations stand out and are significant. What I'm going to tell you about next is at the level of anecdote, essentially, because we didn't explore this in our questionnaire, but a good number of aphantasic participants have told us that they are on the autistic spectrum, and this wouldn't be an enormous surprise, as autism is, of course, classically associated with some impoverishment of imagination and imaginative play in childhood. Another unexpected finding, which many people with aphantasia reported spontaneously, was that they really don't get descriptive prose. So try this. The figures in this boat were those of a strong man with ragged grizzled hair and a sun-browned face, and a dark girl of 19 or 20, sufficiently like him to be recognizable as his daughter. The girl rowed, pulling a pair of sculls very easily. Most of us, many of us, as we read a passage like that, have faint imagery which is sort of hovering somewhere on the fringe of our consciousness. People with aphantasia don't, and they often find passages like these very dull and often don't read much fiction, or if they do, they read it for plot. One of the first people to get in touch after we wrote our paper was Craig Venter, who you may remember was the first person to decode the genome. And he said that he had always attributed his scientific strength in part to the fact that his mind isn't cluttered with imagery. And we have found that there is indeed an apparent excess of first-degree relatives with aphantasia among those who have reported aphantasia, with an elevated sibling recurrence risk. And it turned out that when I began to look for ways of exploring this, 23andMe, the American genetics company, had already added aphantasia to their participant questionnaire, and there's an organization in Israel, MyHeritage, with which we're also participating to try to discover more about the genetics of imagery vividness. The great majority of people who've been in touch have lifelong aphantasia, but a fair number of folk who have lost imagery as a result of brain injury, stroke, head injury, meningitis, have also been in touch. And so we're in the process of trying to make sense of these in terms of an updated version of Martha Farah's model. So here's somebody who was in touch recently, who developed a visual symptom when her neuroglial cyst was treated. You notice that it's left parietal, and the visual symptom was that she no longer enjoyed reading, because novels no longer evoked a visual world. And here is a patient whom I heard about from a colleague in Slovakia, who got in touch because the person to whom this brain belongs had woken up in the night and realized she could no longer visualize. I presume she's one of those people who gets herself to sleep by visualizing. So she was very bothered by this, and she Googled absence of the mind's eye, found the term aphantasia, drove herself to a local hospital and said, I have acute aphantasia and I need a scan. And she turned out to have a deep left parietal fresh infarct. So there are undoubtedly neurogenic mechanisms by which one can acquire aphantasia, but it can also occur in a psychogenic context, as Paolo Bartolomeo, a French imagery researcher, pointed out in a commentary on our original article. I've already mentioned Cotard's syndrome. Cotard reckoned that imagery loss was an integral part of the preconditions for developing his syndrome. I don't know if Tony David is here still, but he has written about the association between depersonalization disorder and reduction in the vividness of visual imagery. And I'm sure John Stone won't be at all surprised that I'm beginning to see people who I think have functional aphantasia having read about it. As an aside, there are in the literature there is some evidence for associations between imagery vividness and a number of other phenomena. So some evidence that your hallucination proneness in Parkinson's disease correlates with your vividness of imagery. Some evidence that high imagery vividness is a risk factor, or an association rather, for schizophrenia. And in this paper it was found both in people with schizophrenia and in first-degree relatives. And some evidence that vividness of visual imagery, or vivid imagery, is a risk factor for intrusive memories, shown in this paper in an experimental paradigm in which people were exposed to distressing videos, and the frequency of intrusive memories was tracked over the following few days. We found an association between extreme imagination and occupation. This is perhaps one of the more robust findings to date. So if you are aphantasic, you're more likely than otherwise to be engaged in a mathematical, computational, or scientific trade, whereas if you are hyperphantasic, you're more likely to be engaged broadly in a creative activity. That, I guess, is what you might have predicted. But there was a nice surprise in our big post bag, and that was contact from quite a large number of aphantasic artists. So this is an image made by an aphantasic artist. Here is a sculpture of a lion, a blind lion made by an aphantasic artist, and a carpet made by the same artist. So we received a sufficient number of contacts to become really interested in this, and in fact, last year we mounted an exhibition of aphantasic and hyperphantasic art in Glasgow and Exeter, funded by the AHRC. And I can tell you more about this if you like in questions, but the aphantasic artists give very interesting descriptions of their process, but the products, I think, are indistinguishable from those of hyperphantasic artists. If you walked around the exhibition, I think you'd be very hard put to it to say which kind of artist produced which work. One or two well-known people have got in touch over the last few years, and one unexpected contact came from a man called Ed Catmull, who was the just retired president of Pixar Disney. And it turned out that he had recognized that he was aphantasic quite early in his career. He's an engineer, in fact, but also a very good manager. And towards the end of his career, in fact, on the point of his retirement, he thought it would be fun to send vividness questionnaires to all his illustrators. And some of them had very vivid imagery, but it turned out that his very favorite illustrator, who's a man called Glenn Keane, who made the illustrations for The Little Mermaid, is aphantasic. And here is a nice video, I hope, of Glenn Keane at work. So he has no visual preconception of what he's going to draw. Produces some squiggles and then works from that. So as our postdoc Matthew McKissick pointed out, if you're aphantasic and you want to know what something looks like, you have to draw it. I mentioned that in our first group of 20 or so, there was an interesting dissociation between involuntary imagery, dream imagery, and wakeful imagery. And this has held up. So I'm sorry, I haven't told you the numbers, have I? The data I'm showing you are from 2,000 aphantasics, 200 hyperphantasics, and 200 controls with average imagery vividness. So the surprise here, to me, is not that there's a difference in the frequency of dream imagery, visual dream imagery, in hyperphantasic and aphantasics, but that 60% of people with aphantasia who lack a mind's eye during the day nevertheless dream visually. Very intriguing, but I think probably not so puzzling for this audience, because of course the two brain states are so very different. There are huge neurochemical differences between wakefulness and REM, predominance of cholinergic drive in REM, a very different kind of neurochemical milieu in wakefulness, and there are major differences in regional brain activation between wakefulness and REM. So for example, deactivation of some frontal regions and hyperactivation of some limbic regions in REM. So one might not have predicted it, but it's not entirely strange that there should be a dissociation between imagery in these two situations. And then the variability as to whether only vision is affected or whether other modalities are affected has also held up. So in the majority of both aphantasics and hyperphantasics, all sensory modalities are affected, but there's appreciable minority in whom some or all other senses are spared. So aphantasics who lack a mind's eye but have a very noisy mind's ear, for example. Oliver Sacks got in touch shortly before his death. He famously lacked a mind's eye, but enjoyed music very much and had a reasonable mind's ear. Blake Ross, who, if you wanted to read one thing about aphantasia, I would suggest you read his Facebook post. He's a Silicon Valley entrepreneur. He created Firefox, Mozilla, realized he was aphantasic when he read a description of our work, and said that his mind was blown, and wrote a very long and entertaining piece about this. So, a final association with hyperphantasia this time. We find that synesthesia is more common among those with hyperphantasia, as has been suggested by previous work from researchers involved in synesthesia research. Now, you might say, you're telling me that this is such a complex and variable phenomenon, I wonder whether it exists at all. I think you would predict that, given that visualization is subserved by quite a complex brain network, you would predict that it would be able to break down in more than one way. So I'm not at all surprised that there is more than one variety of aphantasia. I think there are a number of subtypes which need to be teased out. All the data I've shown you so far comes from first-person report elicited via questionnaires. I'm having extraordinary difficulty in getting this work published for that reason. And of course, the reviewers want us to triangulate these results with neuropsychological testing and brain imaging. And we've begun to do that. So here is a measure of prosopagnosia, which I understand prosopagnosia researchers regard as a reasonably robust first screen for prosopagnosia, and it looks as if there is indeed an elevated rate of face recognition difficulty among those with aphantasia. Our objective tests of famous face recognition were simply too easy. There was a ceiling effect here. There was a small effect in recognition of buildings of increasing levels of obscurity with superiority in the hyperphantasic group, but clearly more work needs to be done to explore face recognition difficulties in people with imagery extremes objectively. However, there is one area in which our pilot neuropsychological study has shown a very clear difference, and that's with respect to autobiographical memory and future thinking. So there is a very clear gradient from hyperphantasia through controls to aphantasic participants in the richness of autobiographical recollection elicited using the Levine autobiographical interview. Same effect seen when you measure internal details, when you rate the richness of the memories. No effect seen with regard to external details, which are kind of additional semantic details which don't contribute to the richness, the experiential richness of the memory. And you see a very similar effect in an imagination task. And I should say that on standard tests of memory, so verbal, visual, anterograde recognition and recall, there is no difference between the groups. So there's a rather selective effect of imagery extremes on autobiographical memory and future thinking. And we're seeing some signatures in our brain imaging. So here is a left parietal region, interestingly, which is more active in hyperphantasic participants than aphantasic participants when you compare imagination with perception. So it's a somewhat complex subtraction, but I think it's probably a real effect because you see the same difference essentially when you compare the controls with the aphantasics. So this is a signature, brain imaging signature seen in an activation task, and doing a resting state analysis, there are stronger prefrontal to visual network connections in hyperphantasic participants than in aphantasic participants. So I think we are beginning to perform the kind of triangulation that our critical reviewers wish to see. And my friend and colleague in Sydney, Joel Pearson, has done what I think is a really nice cognitive neuroscience study to kind of try to tease out the implications of aphantasia, emotional implications of aphantasia. So he read participants' stories which would have an emotional impact on you and I because of the kind of images they evoke. So imagine that the shark is coming closer and closer. You're seeing the fin, it's getting bigger. Most of us, when we are read a story of this kind, conjure up an image which then has an emotional impact. Joel has shown that there is a marked difference between the galvanic skin response in control participants and aphantasic participants when read a story of this kind, but there is no difference when they are shown emotionally arousing photos. So it's not that these aphantasic folk are incapable of mounting an emotional response, it's that they won't mount an emotional response if that depends on a mediating image. Okay, so I don't usually boast about my scores, but our original 2015 paper has an altmetric score of 406, which places it in the top 1% of scientific outputs in relation to the amount of public interest. Now, I don't think this reflects the scientific excellence of our really very modest letter to Cortex. I think it reflects the fact that people are really interested in what goes on in each other's heads. And people with imagery are very fascinated to discover that 2 or 3% of the population don't have it at all, and those who lack it kind of want to know what's going on in our minds, and they're rather glad that some scientific light is being shone on this phenomenon. I think there are 1 or 2 general lessons. The first is that there's a very wide variety of ways in which we can represent things to ourselves in their absence. So when Aristotle said, the soul never thinks without a phantasma, he was clearly wrong if he meant that we can't think without having visual images present in our mind. Some people think using other kinds of imagery. Composers describe very vivid auditory imagery. And of course, some of us clothe our thoughts in other ways altogether, in supramodal or amodal ways. Here is what is apparently rated as the most beautiful equation by mathematicians. And language, for most of us, is a very satisfactory way of representing things in their absence without requiring necessarily any contribution from sensory imagery. And then secondly, we shouldn't confuse visualization with imagination. It's clearly possible to be highly imaginative despite lacking visual imagery. I think imagination is a much broader capacity to conceive, reconfigure things in their absence. So I found myself wondering what is the dimension that we've been exploring here between these 2 visual imagery vividness extremes, aphantasia and hyperphantasia. And the first thought, I guess the obvious suggestion, is that it's a kind of verbal visual dimension. But I don't think that's right. I don't think it's right partly because visual imagery itself is complex. There's a distinction between visual object imagery and visuospatial imagery. It's probably just visual object imagery that is affected in people with aphantasia. But I think it's wrong also because vision clearly isn't the only sensory modality affected in aphantasia. Most people with aphantasia have faint imagery in other senses also. So I don't think that the verbal visual distinction quite captures this. I suspect that what we're exploring here is a tension between 2 tendencies in human thought. One towards abstraction, systematization, semanticization, the other towards more experiential, narrative, episodic modes of thought. But clearly this contrast between the 2 extremes is one small piece in the jigsaw of human variation which we need to explore further. So this work began in Edinburgh with my colleagues Sergio Della Sala and Misha Dewar, and then moved to Exeter, began to involve the members of the Eyes Mind team, and my colleagues Fraser Milton and John Fulford in psychology and brain imaging, and then a whole team of incredibly enthusiastic students without whom it would not have been possible to respond to 14,000 emails, Britt and James, and Mada, and Keelan and Zoe, and Rory came along during this period and has been a great help. And if any of you want to know more about this, we have an Eyes Mind website which will fill you in. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. That was amazing. So any questions? There's a question over there. Dominic. Yeah. Oh, there's that. Here it comes.
I was wondering about your index case. So obviously acute onset, I think you showed the scan was normal. What was going on there?
So very, very good question. We don't know. The assumption was that he had a small stroke related to his angioplasty. He, of course, had some bright areas on MRI, but no more than you would have expected in somebody with vascular disease. He didn't have an acute MRI, so we didn't have any diffusion-weighted imaging from the time at which the loss of imagery occurred. That's a good question, which I can't answer.
Good talk, Adam, but sorry. It was a good talk, and I've sent a commentary to your partner to that effect. In the middle of the century where you said that nothing happened, and I take the point of what you just said about the verbal-visual distinction, but Bartlett talked about verbalizers and visualizers.
Yep.
And I found this very helpful when I was learning anatomy, because I had to learn a rule that the vein came in front of the artery, which came in front of the nerve, and other people, the bastards, could just see the bloody thing.
Yeah, yeah.
But interestingly, I have synesthesia as well, or had.
Yeah.
I think that distinction it needs refining, but it may be of help.
No, I agree. I think it may partially map onto that distinction, but I don't think that captures it entirely. So I agree. I wouldn't discount it or discard it. I think it's relevant. Eileen. Son.
When you showed the video of the cartoonist drawing the Little Mermaid, he was drawing something. He was making a lot of facial expressions.
Yep.
Is there any sense of which they can use a different part of their cortex, the motor cortex, to mediate what they want to represent visually?
I think that's very likely. So clearly, I mean, one of the reasons that many of the tests that purport to be tests of visual imagery fail is that you don't have to use visual imagery, you can use motor imagery precisely. So there's a test in which you're shown an uppercase letter and asked whether the lowercase letter does or doesn't have a curve. Well, that's a hopeless test of vision because you can imagine making the relevant movement. There are multiple forms of representation. Talking to aphantasic artists is really interesting. Some of them say, I have to have the subject in front of me. Some of them say they use preformed materials. Some of them, like Glenn Keane, say that they use the page as their mind's eye. They have a kind of general idea of what they want to produce. They often make a little scribble to get them going, and then they kind of work from that, and then there's a sort of dialogue. It really is an example of extended cognition. I think they're using if you like, they are imagining with the paper or with the pen and the paper.
It reminded me a bit about the idea that patients with Parkinson's disease who are less able to move their face have slightly more difficulty reading emotions and therefore expressing emotions. Is there anything about emotions with these people?
So I think there is, and we haven't really begun to explore that at all fully, but there's first of all the association with autism. Yeah. And then, this is very anecdotal, but quite a lot of people with aphantasia have said, I find it really easy to move on. I have a breakup. Doesn't take long to get over it. I move to a new town. It's pretty easy. Whereas people with aphantasia spend a lot of their time longing and ruminating and regretting. So, I think there may well be an emotional gradient there, but more to do.
Hello. I think you did a very good job at establishing the relation between the recollection and imagination, visualization. However, your fMRI data on the meta-analysis results you presented indicate that imagination is associated with activation of really an attentional network rather than a recollection network. The two things don't seem to go along. I mean, the fMRI data and the psychology of imagination.
No, I agree. In an early version of that Ale meta-analysis, the medial temporal lobe was there, and then it disappeared. And I kept asking Crawford where it had got to. It seemed not to survive the final analysis, but that's a puzzle, and my my guess is that it's some kind of artifact. I agree that it should be there.
Can I just follow on very quickly to that one, Adam?
Yeah.
Because Martha Farah's model would suggest that some people have a visual memory problem and other people have a generation problem. So if you split them according to whether they have autobiographical memory deficits and not, for example, do you notice any other things that fall out of that? Do you find any support for her model?
So the meta-analysis the meta-analysis was of functional imaging studies of visualization in healthy participants, rather than people who've lost imagery as a result of brain injury. But I think there's a lot to learn from that latter group, and that's something I would like to do, but we haven't really scratched that surface yet. So I think there's a nice project there for a PhD there. We have a couple of hundred people with acquired aphantasia for neurological and psychiatric reasons. One of the reasons I like this, Andrew Lees has gone, but one of the reasons I like this topic so much is that it very much speaks to one brain, doesn't it? You can lack imagery lifelong, or you can lose it for respectable neurological or respectable psychiatric reasons. Same outcome, different mechanisms, but ones that very much bind together the people in this room.